He was a lonely rancher who had never forgotten his first love. One evening, he found a mysterious woman bathing in his creek. But as she turned to face him, he realized it wasn't a stranger. It was the very woman who had vanished and broken his heart 10 years ago. This is their story. For 10 years, Jacob Cole's life had been a conversation with the land. He spoke to it through the sweat of his brow, the calluses on his hands, and the steady, rhythmic work that began before sunrise and ended long after sunset. His ranch, carved out of the wild Montana territory, was a testament to his relentless dedication. It was prosperous, orderly, and vast. It was also profoundly empty. Every fence post he had driven, every field he had plowed, was a monument to a ghost with laughing eyes and a spirit as untamed as the wild roses that grew by the creek. Isabella. He hadn't spoken her name aloud in years, but it was etched into every corner of his world. 10 years ago, she had been his entire future. They were young, poor, and recklessly in love, with plans to build this very ranch together. And then, one day, she was simply gone. No letter, no goodbye. She had vanished, taking the color and music from his world, leaving behind only a silence that work could never fully fill. He had poured all his grief, all his anger, all his broken-hearted love into this land. He had built the life they had dreamed of, but he was living it alone. It was during his final round of the evening, checking the fence line along the Cottonwood Creek that bordered his property, that his routine was shattered. He heard a sound that didn't belong, a soft splash, a quiet ripple in the water. His first instinct was caution. Poachers sometimes used the creek to hunt on his land. He dismounted from his horse, moving silently through the trees, his hand resting on the worn grip of his pistol. As he peered through a thicket of willows, he froze. It was not a poacher. In a secluded, sun-dappled bend of the creek, a woman was bathing. Her back was to him, her long, dark hair cascading down her shoulders. She was a trespasser, a stranger. A wave of irritation washed over him. This creek was his private sanctuary, the one place he allowed himself to feel the full weight of his solitude. He was about to step out, to clear his throat and announce his presence, to order her off his land with the same gruff efficiency he applied to everything else in his life. But something made him hesitate. It was the way she moved, a slow, weary grace that spoke of a deep exhaustion, a sadness he recognized all too well. As if sensing his presence, she suddenly stiffened. She turned, her eyes wide with alarm, clutching a piece of clothing to her chest. The setting sun, filtering through the trees, hit her face in a blaze of golden light. And in that instant, the world, for Jacob Cole, stopped turning. His breath caught in his throat. His heart, a thing he thought had long turned to stone, hammered against his ribs with a violent, painful force. It wasn't the face of a stranger. It was a face he had seen every night in his dreams for 10 years. It was older, thinner, etched with lines of hardship he couldn't comprehend, but it was unmistakably, impossibly her. Isabella. For a long, heart-stopping moment, they simply stared at each other across the creek, two ghosts from a forgotten life. A decade of anger, of unanswered questions, of raw, unhealed grief churned inside Jake like a flash flood. The shock of seeing her was quickly consumed by a bitter, burning rage. He stepped out from the cover of the willows, his face a hard, unforgiving mask. Her eyes widened, a flicker of fear replacing her initial surprise as she scrambled to cover herself with a worn, tattered dress. His voice, when he spoke, was a low, dangerous growl, filled with 10 years of pain. He demanded to know what in God's name she was doing there. She flinched, as if struck. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. How could she explain 10 years of silence in a single sentence? Her hesitation only fueled his fury. He took a step closer, his voice rising, the carefully constructed walls around his heart crumbling to reveal the wounded man beneath. He accused her of vanishing, of leaving him without a word, without a letter. He confessed that for years he had oscillated between praying she was alive and praying she was dead, anything to end the torment of not knowing. He asked her, his voice cracking with a decade of suppressed anguish. If the life they had planned, the love they had shared, meant so little that she could discard it like a worn-out shoe. His words were like stones, each one a blow against her fragile composure. She looked down, unable to meet his furious, heartbroken gaze. She was a fortress, her face a closed book, and her silence was, to him, a confession of guilt. He felt a cold resolve harden in his heart. He had built this life without her. He would continue it without her. He was about to order her off his land, to banish this ghost from his sanctuary for good, when a small, timid voice cut through the tense, heavy air. "Mama, is everything all right?" Jake froze, his angry words dying in his throat. He looked past Isabella, towards a dilapidated wagon hidden just beyond the creek. A small girl, no more than 8 years old, was peering out from behind a wheel, her large, dark eyes filled with worry. She looked just like Isabella had at that age. A daughter. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. The years he had spent alone, building this ranch, she had spent building a life, a family, with someone else. The rage did not vanish, but it was suddenly overshadowed by a cold, hollow ache in his chest. He learned then, through her short, clipped sentences, that their wagon had broken an axle, that her husband had died of a fever a few months back, and that she was trying to make her way to a distant town. The sight of the child, so small and frightened, changed everything. His anger, however justified, was powerless against the innocent. The code of the West, the simple code of human decency, took over. With a heavy, resentful heart, he offered them shelter. He told her, his voice now devoid of any warmth, flat and all business, that he was a rancher, not a wheelwright, and fixing a broken axle would take time. A few days, maybe more. Until then, they could stay. He made it clear it was not an invitation born of forgiveness, but a cold, practical necessity. He would not leave a woman and child stranded in the wilderness. He turned and began walking back towards his ranch house, not even looking back to see if she was following. The truce was unspoken, and it was deeply, painfully, awkward. He would help her, but he would not forgive her. Not yet. Walking into Jake's house was the strangest, most painful moment of Isabella's life. It was the house they had designed together, sketching its floor plan on scraps of paper by candlelight, dreaming of the life they would fill it with. She remembered arguing playfully over the size of the kitchen window, him wanting it smaller for warmth, her wanting it larger for the morning light. He had built it larger. The sight of it now, a pane of glass catching the lonely afternoon sun, was a beautiful, heartbreaking testament to a memory he had either cherished or forgotten. The reality of the house was a stark, masculine monument to his solitude. It was meticulously clean, orderly, but it was a man's space, functional and devoid of any softness. There were no curtains, no pictures on the walls, no colorful quilts on the beds. It was a house, but it was not the home she had dreamed of. It was a museum of his life without her. He showed her and Sophie to a small, sparse guest room, his words clipped and formal. He explained the workings of the house, the stove, the water pump, with the detached air of a landlord showing a property to a tenant. He told them meal times were at sunrise and sunset, and that he would be out on the range for most of the day. He was creating walls of routine and distance, a way to survive having her ghost walk his halls. The first days were thick with an almost unbearable tension. They moved around each other like strangers in a space that was simultaneously familiar and alien. For Jake, it was a special kind of torment. Every time he looked at her, he saw two people. He would see the vibrant, laughing girl he had loved, her face full of dreams, and in the blink of an eye, she would resolve into the weary, guarded woman who now occupied her body, her eyes holding a sadness he couldn't penetrate. He would catch her staring out the large kitchen window, and for a second, he would remember the girl who had fought for that extra foot of sunlight. The memory was so vivid, it was like a punch to the gut, and he would have to turn and leave the room, the anger and the old, familiar ache rising in his throat. His torment was compounded by the presence of her daughter. Sophie was a bright, curious child, with her mother's dark eyes and artistic soul. One afternoon, he found her sitting on the porch, carefully arranging pebbles into the shape of a horse. It was a mirror image of Isabella from a lifetime ago. The sight sent a fresh wave of grief and jealousy through him, a phantom of the family he was supposed to have. He retreated to the barn, the sound of the girl's quiet humming a painful echo of a life he had lost. The house was no longer just empty. It was full of the ghosts of what might have been, and their presence was a constant, agonizing reminder. Isabella, in turn, felt like an intruder in her own dream. She saw the life he had built, a life of hard-won success, and felt a profound sense of loss for the years they had been apart. She saw the hardness in his eyes and knew she was the cause of it. Every corner of the house reminded her of a promise she had failed to keep, a future she had lost. The sturdy rocking chair by the fire was the one he had promised to build for her, for their children. Now, it sat empty, a silent accusation. She wanted to explain, to bridge the 10-year chasm of silence between them, but his cold, polite distance was a wall she did not know how to breach. He was a fortress of contained pain. One evening, she cooked a stew, the one his mother used to make, a recipe she had memorized to impress him long ago. She watched his face as he took the first bite, hoping for a flicker of recognition, a sign of the boy he once was. But his expression remained unreadable. He simply ate in silence, thanked her politely as if she were a hired cook, and then retreated to his room. The gesture, meant to be a bridge, had only highlighted the vast distance between them. She focused on her daughter and on the simple tasks of daily life, waiting for a thaw in the cold war they were waging, a thaw that seemed as if it would never come. A week bled into two, and the cold, tense truce in the house on the prairie continued. The walls of silence Jake had built remained standing, but small, hairline cracks were beginning to appear, worn down by the simple, undeniable realities of daily life. He was a man accustomed to solitude, but he was not made of stone. He began to notice things. He noticed the way Isabella, despite her weary exterior, moved with a quiet, determined grace. He saw her face soften when she looked at her daughter, a radiant love that briefly chased the shadows from her eyes. One morning, he was mending a harness in the barn when he heard her humming. It wasn't a sad tune, but a lively, complex folk song he hadn't heard in 10 years. It was the song she had been humming the day he first kissed her, by this very creek. He froze, the leather straps slipping from his fingers. He closed his eyes, and for a fleeting, painful moment, the guarded widow in his house vanished, and in her place was the vibrant, laughing girl of his memory. The moment passed, and the humming stopped as she realized he was there, but the crack in the wall around his heart had widened. A few days later, a more significant event occurred. One of his prized mares, a beautiful but notoriously temperamental horse named Duchess, had gotten a thorn lodged deep in her hoof. She was lame, and her fear made her dangerous, kicking out at anyone who came near. Jake, strong as he was struggling to calm her enough to examine the injury. He had ordered Isabella and Sophie to stay back, his voice sharp with a protective instinct he couldn't suppress. He was about to resort to roping the frantic animal when Isabella stepped forward, ignoring his warning. She did not approach the horse with force, but with a quiet, calming energy. She began to speak to Duchess, not in English but in soft, melodic Italian, the language of her mother. The horse, startled by the strange, gentle sounds, stopped struggling. Its ears twitched, its large, dark eyes fixed on her. Isabella continued to murmur, her voice a hypnotic lullaby, as she slowly, cautiously, reached out and ran a hand down the horse's trembling flank. Duchess shuddered, but she did not pull away. Within a minute, the proud, frantic mare was standing perfectly still, allowing Isabella to gently lift her hoof. Jake watched, utterly stunned. This was the Isabella he remembered, the girl who had an almost mystical connection with animals, a fearless spirit that saw no challenge as insurmountable. He had forgotten that part of her, burying it under a decade of resentment. Now, seeing it again, so vivid and real, his anger felt petty. He quickly and efficiently removed the thorn, and as Isabella continued to soothe the now calm horse, their eyes met over the animal's back. In her gaze, he saw not a stranger, but a partner. The final, definitive crack in the ice came that weekend. It was a warm, lazy afternoon. Jake was on the porch, oiling his saddle, when he saw Sophie sitting in the dirt of the yard. The little girl was completely absorbed, a stick in her hand, drawing with an intense focus. Curious, Jake walked over, peering over her shoulder, his breath caught in his throat. She was not just scratching lines in the dirt. She was drawing, and she was brilliant. With a few, simple strokes, she had captured the exact likeness of Duchess, the proud arch of her neck, the intelligent look in her eye. It was a sketch so full of life and talent, it was breathtaking. It was a talent he had only ever seen in one other person. He looked from the drawing in the dirt to Isabella, who was watching them from the doorway with a sad, knowing smile. In that moment, the last of his anger, the last of his hardened resentment, finally dissolved. This little girl, this living, breathing piece of Isabella, was the undeniable proof of the woman he had first fallen in love with, the artist, the horse whisperer, the untamed spirit. The ghost in his house suddenly had a face, a voice, a soul again. And he knew, with a certainty that both thrilled and terrified him, that he was in danger of falling in love with her all over again. The discovery of Sophie's talent was a turning point. The ghost of Jake's anger had been exorcised, replaced by the ghost of a love he thought long dead. The tension that had defined their cohabitation evaporated, leaving a quiet, fragile space for the truth to finally emerge. That evening, he did not retreat to his room after their silent supper. Instead, he found Isabella on the porch, staring out at the darkening prairie. He brought out 2 cups of coffee and sat not beside her, but on the steps below, a gesture of humility, giving her the space, the power, and the conversation that was to come. He didn't demand an explanation. He simply asked, his voice softer than she had heard it in 10 years. He told her he had seen the girl she used to be, glimpses of her in the woman she had become, and in her daughter. He said he was done being angry. He just needed to understand. His gentleness, after weeks of cold distance, was the key that finally unlocked the vault of her own decade-long pain. And so, in the quiet of the twilight, she told him her story. Her voice, at first a trembling whisper, grew stronger as she unburdened the secret she had carried alone for so long. She spoke of the weeks after he had left to take that cattle drive job, the job that was supposed to earn them the final bit of money to buy this very land. She had written to him every day, letters filled with love and plans and dreams. But she never received a single reply. As weeks turned into a month, a cold, terrifying fear began to creep into her heart. Had he forgotten her? Had he found someone else? Her father, a proud, controlling man who had always despised Jake, calling him a penniless ranch hand unworthy of his daughter, saw her despair and seized his opportunity. He began his cruel, calculated campaign. He would sigh with false pity, telling her that men like Jake were unreliable, that their promises were as fleeting as the summer dust. He would leave newspaper clippings on the table about boom towns in the north, suggesting Jake had simply followed the lure of gold and fortune, leaving her behind. The final, devastating blow came in the form of a letter with a postmark from a town hundreds of miles away. It was not from Jake, but from a man claiming to be his new employer. The letter, written in a neat, official hand, was short and brutal. It stated that Jacob Cole had taken a permanent position, that he had spoken of a youthful entanglement he had left behind, and that he had asked his employer to inform her that he would not be returning. It was a cold, clinical dismissal. Isabella told Jake how she had shattered. The letter, so formal, so cruel, so unlike the boy she loved, had been the undeniable proof. He had abandoned her. The world she had built with him crumbled into dust. It was then that her father made his final move. He introduced her to a wealthy, older merchant from the city, a man he had chosen for her. He told her it was time to put away childish dreams, to make a practical, respectable match. Numb with a grief so profound she could barely breathe, and believing the man she loved was gone forever, she had agreed. She was married and gone within a month, a prisoner of her father's ambition and a lie so cruel it had stolen her life. She explained that she had only learned the truth 2 years ago, after her father's death. While sorting through his papers, she had found them. A hidden box. Inside, tied with a faded ribbon, was every single letter she had ever written to Jake, unopened. And beneath them, drafts of the forged letter, written and rewritten in her father's own hand until it was perfect. The truth was a physical blow. He had never abandoned her. He had been waiting, just as she had. Her father had not just separated them, he had stolen a decade of their lives. After her own husband died, she had used what little money she had to travel back to the one place she thought she might find him, to the land of their shared dream. She wasn't expecting forgiveness. She just needed him to know the truth. As her story ended, she was openly weeping, the silent, stoic mask she had worn for years finally washed away by a flood of sorrow. Jake sat on the steps below, motionless, the coffee in his cup long gone cold. The anger he had harbored for 10 years was gone, replaced by a grief so immense it felt like his own heart was breaking all over again. Not for himself, but for her. For them. For the life they had lost. Isabella's confession washed away a decade of bitterness and misunderstanding, leaving in its wake a shared, profound grief for the life that had been stolen from them. The next morning, the atmosphere in the house was transformed. The awkwardness was gone, replaced by a fragile, tentative intimacy. They were no longer a lonely rancher and a guarded widow. They were Jake and Isabella again, two halves of a whole, cautiously finding their way back to each other. Jake's heart, once a fortress of anger, was now an open wound of regret and a fierce, protective tenderness. He looked at her, at the lines of hardship etched on the face he still adored, and felt a burning rage, not at her, but at the father who had orchestrated their pain. He watched her with her daughter, Sophie, and saw not a reminder of a life with another man, but a testament to her incredible resilience, her ability to create love and beauty even in the darkest of circumstances. His purpose, which for 10 years had been simply to work and to forget, now had a new, clear focus: to protect her, to heal her, to give her the safety she had been denied for so long. This fragile new peace, however, was destined to be short-lived. A few days later, as they were working together to repair the axle on her old wagon, a fine, polished carriage utterly out of place in the rugged landscape appeared on the long road leading to the ranch. Two men, dressed in severe, dark city suits, dismounted. Isabella froze, her hand flying to her mouth, a look of pure dread washing over her face. Jake recognized the look instantly. It was the look of a cornered animal. They were her late husband's older brother, a stern, humorless banker named Alistair, and the family's lawyer. They had not come out of concern. They had come on business. Alistair barely acknowledged Jake, his cold eyes dismissing him as nothing more than a hired hand. He addressed Isabella directly, his tone devoid of any warmth or sympathy. He informed her that, according to her late husband's will, upon his death, the guardianship of their daughter, Sophie, and the considerable inheritance left to the child was to be managed by his family. He had come, he stated, to take Sophie back to the city to be raised in a proper, civilized environment. The words were a calculated cruelty, a death sentence to the new life Isabella had just begun to hope for. She stood, trembling, trying to protest that a child belonged with her mother, but the lawyer coolly interrupted. He explained that the will also contained a morality clause, a common legal tool of the time, stating that if the surviving parent's living situation was deemed unstable or morally questionable, the family could petition the court for full custody. A lone woman, living unchaperoned on a remote ranch with a bachelor. I think any judge would agree that qualifies as morally questionable. The choice is yours, Isabella. Give us the girl peacefully, or we will take her, and we will ensure you are ruined in court. It was a monstrous, legal trap. They were using her daughter as a hostage, her past helplessness as a weapon against her. They didn't care about Sophie, they cared about her inheritance. Isabella looked at her daughter, who was hiding behind her skirts, and felt a wave of despair so profound it threatened to swallow her whole. After a decade of being a prisoner to her father's lies and a loveless marriage, she was about to become a prisoner to her in-laws' greed. It seemed there was no escape. Alistair's ultimatum hung in the air, cold and final. He had cornered her perfectly, using the cruel logic of the law and societal judgment as his weapons. Isabella stood frozen, the color drained from her face, the defiant strength she had shown just days before crumbling in the face of this new, monstrous threat. To lose her daughter, it was a fate worse than any she had endured. All the pain, all the loss of the past decade seemed to coalesce into this single, horrifying moment. She was about to break, but she was not alone anymore. Jake, who had been standing silently by the wagon, his face an unreadable mask, finally moved. He didn't shout. He didn't draw his gun. He simply walked, his steps slow and deliberate, until he was standing directly in front of Isabella, his body a solid, living shield between her and her tormentors. He was no longer the heartbroken man, lost in the past. He was the master of this ranch, and these were trespassers threatening his home. He looked down at the banker, Alistair, and the lawyer, his eyes as cold and hard as winter steel. This was his all-in moment. The moment he stopped regretting the past and started fighting for the future. He spoke, his voice not loud, but carrying a weight of authority that made both city men take an involuntary step back. He informed them, in a tone that left no room for argument, that Isabella's living situation was, indeed, about to change. He agreed that it was not proper for a lone woman to live unchaperoned. Therefore, he said, he was rectifying the situation. He then turned, not to the men, but to Isabella. He reached down and gently took her hand, his warm, calloused fingers enveloping hers. He looked into her terrified eyes, and his gaze was a promise, a vow, a declaration for all to hear. I am formally asking Isabella Vance to be my wife. We will be married by the week's end. As her husband, I will be the legal guardian of her daughter, Sophie. This will be their home. He then turned his cold gaze back to Alistair. Her living situation will be unimpeachable, and this family will be under my protection. So I suggest you get back in your fancy carriage and ride off my land. And if you ever threaten my family again, you will be dealing with me, not with her. The declaration was absolute. It was a checkmate. He had not just offered her help. He had offered her his name, his home, his protection, and his future. He had publicly claimed her, not as a lost love, but as his wife-to-be. Isabella stared at him, tears streaming down her face, not tears of sorrow, but of a profound, overwhelming relief and a love reborn. In her darkest moment, he had not just offered her a shield. He had become her fortress. Jake's declaration hung in the air, a brilliant, unexpected maneuver that shattered Alistair's carefully constructed legal trap. The banker, a man used to getting his way through intimidation and the power of his name, was momentarily stunned into silence. The lawyer, a weaselly man, began to stammer, protesting that this was a sham, a desperate trick to circumvent a legal will. Alistair quickly recovered his composure, his face twisting into a cruel sneer. He accused Jake of being a simple-minded rancher, claiming their impromptu engagement was a farce that would never hold up in court. He threatened to drag their names through the mud, to paint Isabella as a desperate woman of loose morals and Jake as an opportunist trying to get his hands on Sophie's inheritance. He believed his power and influence in the city could crush this provincial rancher. But he had made a fatal miscalculation. He was not in his city anymore. He was in Jake Cole's territory, and he had underestimated the man he was facing. Jake didn't even flinch at the threats. He simply looked at the lawyer, his voice calm and dangerously low. He informed them that while they were busy making threats, his ranch hand was already on the fastest horse, riding to town to fetch the sheriff. A sheriff, Jake reminded them, who was an old friend of his, a man who took a very dim view of city folk coming onto his land and threatening his citizens. He added that the sheriff would be very interested to hear about their attempt to extort a grieving widow and kidnap her child under the guise of a questionable morality clause. Jake then turned his attention back to Alistair. He spoke of the will and of the law. He calmly pointed out that any court would look far more favorably on a child being raised by her loving mother and a respectable, land-owning stepfather than being taken away by a distant uncle with a clear financial motive. He mentioned that he would be more than happy to use his own considerable resources to hire the best lawyers in the territory to protect his new family's interests. He was not just a rancher. He was a successful, respected man with a reputation for unwavering integrity. It was his word against the greedy city bankers. The final, devastating blow was not a threat, but a simple act of unity. Isabella, her tears now dried, stepped forward and slid her hand into Jake's, lacing her fingers with his. She stood beside him, no longer a victim, but his equal partner. Sophie, seeing her mother's courage, ran out from behind the wagon and hugged Isabella's leg, glaring defiantly at the two strangers. The image was undeniable, a strong, united family, standing together on their own land. The lawyer paled, recognizing the complete collapse of their legal position. He began whispering urgently to Alistair, advising a strategic retreat. Alistair, his face contorted with impotent fury, saw that he had been utterly and completely defeated. He had come expecting to find a broken, helpless woman. Instead, he had found a fortress guarded by a man he could not intimidate and a woman he could no longer break. With a final, hateful glare, the two men turned, climbed back into their fancy carriage, and rode away in a cloud of dust, their power rendered useless against the simple, unshakable strength of a family united. Jake, Isabella, and Sophie stood together, watching them go, the threat finally, truly, and permanently banished from their lives. With the threat of the past finally banished, a profound peace settled over the ranch. The ghosts that had haunted the house for a decade were finally laid to rest, replaced by the sounds of a new life beginning. Jake Cole and Isabella Rossi were married a week later, in a simple ceremony by the Cottonwood Creek where they had been reunited. Their only guests were the sheriff, a few trusted ranch hands, and their daughter, Sophie, who acted as the joyful, beaming flower girl. The years of anger and sorrow melted away, and the love they had shared as youths blossomed anew, now deeper and stronger, tempered by the hardships they had both endured. The ranch was no longer a monument to Jake's solitude, but a bustling, happy home. Isabella's laughter, a sound Jake thought he would never hear again, now echoed in every room. And Sophie, for the first time in her young life, had a father, a man who taught her to ride horses and who looked at her mother with a love so deep it was a tangible presence. 1 year later, on the anniversary of their wedding, Jake led Isabella to the old barn. The air was thick with the sweet smell of hay and leather. He walked to a far corner, to a loose floorboard he had never shown anyone. He pried it open, and from the small, hidden space beneath, he lifted a small, dust-covered wooden box. He placed it in her hands. She opened it carefully. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was a stack of letters, tied with a brittle ribbon. They were her letters, the ones she had written to him 10 years ago, all returned to sender, unopened. But that was not all. Beneath them was another, much larger stack of letters, written in his own familiar, strong hand. They were addressed to her, at her father's old address. They were dated, one for every week, for the first 2 years after she had vanished. With tears streaming down her face, she opened the top one. It was a letter full of a young man's desperate love, pleading for an answer, asking why she had gone silent. She opened another and another. They were filled with his pain, his confusion, his unwavering love, and his promises to wait for her. They were all the words she had longed to hear, a decade too late, yet arriving right on time. He explained, his voice thick with emotion, that after 2 years of silence, he had finally accepted that she was gone, but he could never bring himself to burn the letters. They were the only piece of her he had left. She looked up at him, her heart overflowing with a love so immense it felt boundless. The last, tiny scar on her soul had finally healed. The truth was not just that her father had betrayed her. The truth was that Jake had never, not for a single moment, stopped loving her. You waited. All this time, you waited. My heart never left this creek, Isabella. It was just waiting for you to come home. And as he kissed her, surrounded by the ghosts of their shared past, they were no longer ghosts but beautiful, vibrant memories. They had not just rekindled an old flame. They had finally, after 10 long, stolen years, begun the life they were always meant to live. Their love a testament to the fact that some promises are too strong to be broken by time, and some hearts are destined to find their way back to each other, no matter how long the journey. If this story of a love that conquered time touched your heart, click the video on your screen now for another unforgettable tale from the Wild West. Don't forget to subscribe and tell us what part of the story you loved most. Your support helps us write new, happy endings.